So welcome everybody. My name's Tony Fransen and I'm the Environment and Welfare Manager for LIC and the R&D group at Newstead. So environment and welfare, I kind of look at my role very much as trying to balance up what we do on farm and what our communities and consumers want to see from farming and the products that we provide. So I see it very much about the social license for us to operate, and our community that we're trying to answer to is quite diverse because we sell products here in New Zealand and globally to a whole diverse range of people with different expectations. And to what you might see within your own river catchment and what people want to see there can be quite different to somebody shopping in a supermarket anywhere else in the world. So really we have to be, and with the connection of like today, modern technology, social media and the likes, the gap between what we do on farm and what the consumer can see overseas is a lot smaller than it ever used to be. So it's really very much about understanding this. So today I'm going to focus around the environment, but obviously animal welfare is still a key part to what we are working on here. I'm going to start off just looking at a high-level overview of what's happening in the environmental space, bring it down to the cow level, and then look at some of the research we've got going forward. So in terms of greenhouse gas emissions on farm, there's a lot of talk about greenhouse gas emissions, but it's really important to understand what's sort of going on. So the cow's kind of at the centre, and we do have a cycle going on within our agricultural systems where carbon dioxide is coming in and out. And so it is a cycle, it is a flow, and it's balanced. So we don't need to worry so much about the carbon dioxide emissions within this part of the cycle. It's really the focus areas for us need to be around the methane, which is coming from cow burps, and the nitrous oxide, which is coming from urinary nitrogen from the other end of the cow. So it's these two bits here, which are the key focus for our greenhouse gas emissions from a farm level. So the work I'm talking about, I'm going to be referring to enteric methane from those burps and the urinary nitrogen. So if we have a look at the legislation, so this is what the government's brought out as a response from the Zero Carbon Bill, the changes that have happened to the Climate Change Response Act. So our legislation now says that we have to be, by 2030, our biogenic methane levels, which is pretty much all of those cow burps with a little bit of methane from landfills and things like that, mostly cow burps, need to be 10% below our 2017 levels by 2030, and somewhere in the range of 24 to 47% by 2050. And that's dependent on what science allows us to do in that time period. But all other gases, so the carbon dioxides and nitrous oxides, etc., they need to be at net zero by 2050. So that's the high level of legislation. Then below that, the government has to come up with 5-yearly emissions budgets, and the Climate Change Commission has to recommend this to the government. So earlier this year, Climate Change Commission brought out a draft report saying what their emissions budgets would roughly look like, and thus estimating that by 2030, we should be about 13% below our 2017 levels, so slightly overshooting. A lot of industry parties, so Dairy NZ and Federated Farmers, for example, leading the charge on this, saying actually 10% is our legislation, why are you pushing us over and beyond? So some of you farmers may have submitted on this as well. There is still an opportunity as this goes through, and as government, so end of May, the Commission has to recommend to government, and then the government has to decide how they're going to adopt these recommendations. So there is still a chance for all of the stuff to change through that process. But I think we need to recognise that it's not just about what the government says and what the legislation is. It's actually we need to see what our global markets are doing. So New Zealand dairy, we produce a lot of food that goes into some of these big multinationals in the ingredients sector. And if you look at some of the sustainability statements, and I'm not going to go through them, but you can read them through there on the slide. Starbucks, Nestle, Mars, McDonald's, they all have these big claims about how they want to reduce their supply chain emissions, for which we are part of that supply chain. So they're going to be continually looking for low emissions intensity product. And so we need to keep a focus on that emissions intensity. The government might be looking at things from a total carbon or a total methane level, but these buyers will be looking at things from an emissions intensity level. So we need to have both things in scope as we go forward. But going from government legislation to what does that actually mean for me on my farm is where it can be quite challenging to see how it all fits in together. And so you've possibly heard of He Waka e Kanoa, which is a work program between the primary sector organisations, so the likes of Dairy NZ, Beef and Lamb, FAR, Hort New Zealand, Federated Farmers, and Ministry for the Environment and Ministry for Primary Industries working together to actually go, how can we get to a level where we can have emissions accounted for at a farm level? So you as an efficient farmer can actually be recognised for the work that you do against a farmer who may be less efficient or higher emissions on their property. So really important that this actually happens to allow us to innovate and adopt those practices. And some of the big things here is that by February 2022, the partnership, so He Waka Eke Noa Working Group, will have recommendations to the government on what on-farm emissions accounting and on-farm pricing might look like. So that will go to the government, and again, it's up to the government on how that will be adopted. But hopefully, as it's been a partnership in development, it should be adopted reasonably well to what's recommended. I'll say that that's still all in the government hands, and they can decide to change things at any point. So that's kind of at a high level what's happening in the greenhouse gas space. Water quality is an interesting one to try and go, how do I simplify this at a national level? Every region has got slightly different catchments, got different rules, but I think if we boil it down to what are some of the key things we're trying to address and achieve with water quality, I've got sort of 4 key areas that we want to try and reduce the amount of nutrient contamination as well as pathogens, so any bugs or viruses, and what other sediment, soil loss things are going in the waterways, which are causing issues. So that's kind of the high-level objectives, what we're trying to achieve and the areas we need to be focusing on. If we look at good management practices that might come into these areas, there's a whole bunch of things that a lot of you will be doing on farm and going, well, how can I make sure that I'm managing my environment through good farm environment management practices? And so that's just an example. There's a whole raft you could chuck on there, but that just gives you a few examples there. Then over top of all of that, with the action for healthy waterways that the government's brought out, we now have a whole layer of national legislation sitting there, rules and laws saying what we can and can't do on particular things. And some of them are still a little bit grey, so the likes of the winter grazing rules have been pushed out for a year. That doesn't mean they've gone away. It just means we need to demonstrate that we're able to do good management practice without those draconian laws overarching all of that. So I'm not going to go into the details of specific laws. If you want to get into those details, the Dairy NZ website's a great source of information, got all the rules plotted out on the timeframes they come in. But these are the kind of the issues. And nitrogen, phosphorus, they're the main contaminants that we need to be looking at in terms of how we manage that on farm, sediment around the waterways particularly. There is still change coming here. We're not in a place where everything's settled. This regional councils still need to work on their plans for how to implement this. And the top left corner, there's a little box just appeared, DIN levels, so the dissolved inorganic nitrogen, which is still being worked out how to address this, the nitrogen levels in waterway. So there's a working group there, and that rule could still come into play sometime in the not too distant future. But exactly what that looks like, not sure yet. So that's it at a high level, kind of the policy side of things. Now I'm going to start bringing it down to the farm system and in particular the animals themselves on the farm. So I've simplified the farm system into this little circle diagram here. And so we can look at a farm system or a farm that you might be living on or working on and go, we've got kind of the capital that's tied up with that, whether if that's the land, the infrastructure, the people, or what sort of debt loading there might be against that land. That kind of governs what you can do within that. And on top of that, you can decide how intense you want to be operating that land, whether if it's low, high, how much feed comes in, fertilizer, etc. And then whatever feed system you got sitting there, what you want to be doing as a dairy farmer is turning as much of that feed into milk product that you can sell as you possibly can. And so overlapping that's kind of your herd and your production, but the environmental footprint goes over all parts to that. But we need to understand how that relates to the total product leaving the farm. So some of the work that we've been doing here at LIC is actually delving into those internal circles a little bit more and looking at, okay, historically we've been good in the darker circles to go, what's our total milk production, what's our cow population or our herd size, and what's our production per cow. Yep, we've been tracking that for years and years and years, but actually we need to be factoring the environment into here. And if we were to focus just down on the bottom part, what we'll see here, if we're just looking at footprint per cow, you actually might go in the wrong direction because you might be losing the production from that cow. You need a cow that's highly productive. And so the area we need to be looking at is around this footprint per product, or the emissions intensity of the product, which is kind of what the Nestle's and the Mars and the McDonald's, etc., are looking for, is that low intensity per kilogram of product. And so we've come up with an index that ranks the animals in this space called hoof print. So it's ranking particularly on that footprint per kilogram of product. So what is the hoof print model? Yes, it is a model. It is calculated based on the animal's breeding values. And so each individual animal that's assessed, and at this stage we're using it on our breeding bulls, which are marketed out through our catalogue. We use 7 breeding values from those bulls. We run that through the core of the model, and all of the calculations that sit inside there for the energy requirements and the partitioning of nutrients and energy and the outputs all relate to the calculations that sit in the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Inventory. So that's what we're already legislated and reporting on at an international level, but this time doing it at an individual animal level. And then from that, we get individual animal outputs. So what's its total emissions, what's its excretion, what's its production over the animal's lifetime. And then we can look at that relative to each other. And the key thing here, as I said on the previous circle diagram, was comparing its production to its lifetime emissions or excretion. And so if we plot out for urinary nitrogen, what's the urinary nitrogen over its lifetime per kilogram of milk solid over its lifetime? And what we can see on this graph here is the high genetic merit animals to the right and the low genetic merit animals to the left, as measured with BW. And you can see the environmental footprint of those higher genetic merit animals is a lot lower than those of low genetic merit. And so roughly for every 10 BW increase you have on the animal, you're getting about 1.7 grams less urinary nitrogen per kilogram of milk solid. So they're getting more of that nitrogen out through their milk protein, and things like lower replacement rate and things like that come into it as well. So those animals are just more efficient all round. So BW is a really good estimate of environmental efficiency. And if we look at the LIC Premier Sires team over the last 30 years, so this is all breeds, breed weighted average, what we can see there is that we've actually had a 16% reduction in urinary nitrogen per kilogram of milk solid as we've been breeding for more and more efficient animals, and also the value of milk protein. So we've increased the protein yields from the animals, which has been taking more of that nitrogen away from excretion and urine. If we jump to the other side and look at the methane part to the equation, again, we get the same shape graph. Some of the animals slightly move, but it's roughly the same relationship. And for every 10 BW units this time, we're getting about 2 grams less methane per kilogram of milk solid. So again, whether if it's water quality, whether if it's greenhouse gases, if we're going for the more efficient high BW animals, we're actually heading in the right direction environmentally as well. And over that same 30-year period for the Premier Sires daughter proven team, we've seen a 13% reduction in enteric methane per kilogram of milk solid. So that's all a really good story, but what's kind of driving this? So if we delve a little bit deeper into those results and look at some of the individual traits that sit behind it, any trait that we assess, so I said there were 7 traits in there, and I'll bring them up. So on the bottom left there, you've got 6 of the 7 traits. Any of these traits will have some form of normal distribution. And if we focused on the breeding for any one of those and tried to move the population 1 standard deviation to the left, as shown by this orange arrow here, what would that mean for the environmental or output results from these animals? And so if we looked at just milk production, if we increased live weight, for example, by 1 standard deviation, we'd actually have a negative response on milk solids production. Because those animals are bigger, but their production hasn't increased, you need to put more energy to maintenance. So that's a negative effect on total production. And this is on the assumption that you're keeping your feeding level constant. If we were able to increase your milk solids components without any increase in live weight or anything else, we've got a positive effect in production because we're diluting down that maintenance requirement of the animals relative to what's going out in production. Volume, a negative effect, and your fertility, longevity, and gestation length, which isn't shown on this slide, but is in a similar ballpark to these two as well. And then if we looked at the environmental side of it, so red being a negative effect and green being a positive effect, we can see here that, again, if we're able to increase those milk solids components, we've got a good positive effect on the environmental footprint. Increasing live weight without any increase in milk production yields has quite a large negative effect. And then we get positive effect by increasing our longevity type traits, longevity and fertility traits there. What I will say on this slide is the way that the model calculates it, culling of empty cows is accounted for in longevity. So the fertility component actually is slightly bigger when you take into account that empty cow culling sits in the longevity part of this equation. But you can see there the relative impacts. And as I said earlier, the protein component, when you're looking at nitrogen, driving that value for protein has a big impact on the nitrogen that's left over for the urine patch. So with live weight having a big component of, I suppose, the negative effect, what does it look like if we just pulled out live weight? So on this graph to the left here, this is the live weight breeding value. So looking at the zero of around 500 kilograms of live weight as the base cow, you can see there that there is an effect of the heavier animals having a slightly higher environmental footprint per kilogram of milk solid than the slightly lighter animals. But we need to understand how that fits within your farm system too. So you've got to still have the right cow for your infrastructure and your location, but there is a relationship there. And if we look, and I'll talk about methane star ratings in a moment, but what you need to know here for this graph is the 10 is the most efficient and the 1 is the least efficient. And this is looking at a group of animals from most efficient to least efficient. And the big thing here is the amount of energy over the animal's lifetime that they're able to put towards milk production versus what they are requiring to maintain themselves. And so it's this dark blue relative to the light blue that shows where the efficiency gain is actually being made. So we want them to be putting energy to production, and maintenance is just a cost. So that's where the energy and where that efficiency is coming from. So how have we turned this into a rating that's been used in the genetics catalogue? So we've used the hoof print and the hoof print label and a hoof print diagram to display this, with 10 being the most efficient animal and 1 being the least efficient animal. And so what we've done, we've got urinary nitrogen on one side and enteric methane per kilogram of lifetime production. And we've split the population, which is the last 10 years of dairy genetics. So any bull that's been registered in an AI progeny scheme, excluding any specialty products such as short gestation length, and then splitting them over a normal distribution based on their results. So only the top 2% of bulls end up being a 10-star rating, the next 5% 9, so on and so forth. So that's how this has been developed and how that's marketed. So this year, so this was first launched in the 2020 catalogue. It's out again in the 2021 catalogue. This year in the 2021 catalogue, we've also included beef print, which is looking at our beef size and those that we have enough data from. So that's one of the challenges with beef, is getting enough breeding value data from them. But this time we're looking at the environmental footprint, both in urinary nitrogen and enteric methane per kilogram of meat yield from a terminal animal born from that sire. And so we've got a slightly different reference population and slightly different breeding values, but it's still the same philosophy of taking those breeding values through the greenhouse gas model and working out what the total production is relative to its environmental footprint. So look for that on some of the beef bulls in the catalogue as well. So another thing that we can look at is replacement rates and how long cows last in a herd. So another piece of work we did was just looking at what's if our average number of lactations on farm was 4 lactations, and we're able to extend that to 5 lactations because our cows are actually of a genetic merit that can handle that extra lactation without health or fertility effects. And by doing this, we're actually able to reduce the environmental footprint per kilogram of milk solid, both in terms of urinary nitrogen, just over 5%, and methane just under. And the key things that we're doing to achieve that is we've got less replacement stock required, but we've also got higher per cow production because the cows in that 4 to 8 year age bracket, the engine room of your milk production, produce at slightly higher levels than the younger animals. So we have a higher proportion of the herd producing at a higher level. So that's how we're able to drive that efficiency gain there. You still need to make sure that you're maintaining your optimum replacement rate so that you're not getting into trouble where you're stuck with cows which aren't actually physically able to stay longer or have got other issues. But that's the effect that changing the replacement rate has on farm. So we've got to make sure that we're not being wasteful in that space. In terms of the research that we've got going forward, so this is looking at the greenhouse gas emissions, and this was produced by the Biological Emissions Reference Group, so a primary sector group looking at what can be achieved on farm through different technologies and things. And a couple of key things I want to draw your attention to there is the two blue lines. So we've got enhanced animal performance, which is kind of the area that I'm talking about around this whole cow efficiency side of things. But also this darker blue section in the middle, which is around low methane breeding and genetics. So there are a couple of areas that LIC can really focus on for how we can contribute. So Lorna McNaughton, a senior scientist here at LIC, and shown in the top left photo there, presented on the shed share last week. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this project. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that we are measuring young bulls for methane emissions with the aim to measure their daughters in the years to come and see if we can identify a methane emissions breeding value or a feed utilisation breeding value, or maybe both, that we can then incorporate into the likes of Hoofprint to actually get more robust individual data on these animals to hopefully bend that curve down and get even greater levels of emissions efficiency. Another key research project that we've got going on is Resilient Dairy. So it's a 7-year research program, really looking at the health, longevity, genomic selection and identification of animals to try and drive that the efficiency and the longevity side of the equation. And if we can help have cows be healthy and happy on farm for longer, then we can start to have some of those effects of the enduring cows and the lower replacement rates, etc. But we need to make sure we're identifying that we have the right healthy cows in the system. So some really cool initiatives going on in this program, and some of the other shed shares that are happening through this series include different parts of this research program. So keep an eye out of things around Resilient Dairy. Another one that I want to draw your attention to is being led by Dairy NZ, but it's the low nitrogen livestock program, really looking at ways that they can choose animals and genetically select around reducing that urinary nitrogen load. So they've had some research programs going on to date. There's some results due out shortly, and they're just trying to work on what their next year's research plan looks like, which we're hoping to hear about soon. So keep an eye on that program, because if nitrogen's an issue for you and your catchment, hopefully there's some stuff come from there. So just wrapping up from me, really important that we understand that there's a whole heap happening in the regulatory space, but animal efficiency and the efficiency of your farm business and turning that feed into production is really important and is going to be a key part to achieving the environmental goals. So get your handle around how that contributes. So Hoofprint is a tool that we've developed to help you with the identification of which animals might be more environmentally friendly than others. And so keep an eye on that in the catalogue. And there's still some really exciting key research programs going on. I've just focused on ones around the animal. There's a lot of other things going on, especially in the greenhouse gas space around feed, inhibitors, vaccines, all of that. But there's some really interesting science that will hopefully help at a farm level. Cool, that's it from me, and I hope to take some questions.
Here's a good one. So Tony, given the effect of live weight on enteric methane, should we be doing some work around residual feed intake instead so we can more accurately measure efficiency?
Yep, so we need to understand feed intake. So the methane project, that's a key component to the measures. So not only are we measuring the methane emissions from the bulls, we're measuring their feed intake. And when we do the research on the daughters, we need to understand and measure accurately what that feed intake is too. So at the moment, when you calculate methane emissions at a herd level or at any level, it's for every kilogram of dry matter that's consumed, it's multiplied by 21.6 grams, and that gives you your total methane emissions. But we need to understand if the animals, and what we want to do is is there a genetic difference in that? So are they plus or minus? Is one animal 21? Is another animal 22? Okay, can we breed from that 21? But feed intake is a key component. Unfortunately, it's very difficult and very expensive to measure in a pastoral system, but in the barn system, we're replicating that as close as we can.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tony. I do have one from our audience. So a question around bull teams. So people buying bull team products, where we don't nominate or choose a specific bulls, i.e. daughter proven or A2 teams, are you trending these teams towards these environmental components?
Yep. So all of our team products in the catalogue have a hoof print rating on the teams. So you can compare team against team. And so, yep, that data is available. Over time, we will be including this more on the selection side of things. If we're still in year 2 and the bulls take many years to come through the breeding programs, so we're definitely looking at how we choose and select bulls relating to hoof print. At this point in time, it's very much, we've got a good correlation with hoof print and BW. BW is still the key driver, but absolutely, if there's 2 bulls of equivalence, then that might be the tiebreaker.
Have we seen any breed differences?
Yep, so in terms of breed differences, there tends to be slightly higher efficiency side of things on the lighter breeds, so the Jersey and the crossbred. And if you do the calculations on what the kilograms milk solids per kilogram live weight component is, that tends to be where the lighter breeds have an advantage, and that comes through into the hoof print ratings as well.
Thanks, Tony. And thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Please keep an eye out on the LIC website for up and coming shed shares, and of course, our previous ones that we have recorded and now available. And any suggestions on future shed shares, actually, we'd love to hear from you. So by all means, send us a message. We'd love to hear from you. But on behalf of Tony, myself, Esther and Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today and appreciate your time today. Thanks, Tony. Good session.
Thank you.